Hi, and welcome to this week's current news. Today is Wednesday, February 19th, 2025. In Chicago, cognitive behavioral therapy shows some promise curbing youth violence. In the Englewood neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, nearly 100 people were shot last year. And many of the young people living there will tell you the violence weighs on them. It affects me as a young black man because walking down the street with your friends, you got to worry about, oh, watch that car, oh, watch that alley. It's a 17-year-old AM. You get so used to it, it ain't even no point. Like, even when they be shooting, I still sit there in the bed and watch TV, says DB, also 17. NPR is referring to these students by their initials to protect them from stigma they might face for speaking about their experience. These reactions, feeling numb or hyper alert, are signs of chronic stress, and adults at their high school took note. Last year, they were tapped for a youth program that showed promising results in reducing violence. It relied in part on a concept borrowed from poker. On Tilt with Guns. Choose to Change is a 6-month program that focuses on young people who are already struggling. Many have been arrested or have gaps in school enrollment. Some may be affiliated with gangs or on juvenile probation. Students in the program are paired with mentors and attend weekly group therapy, where clinicians use cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, to help change their thought patterns, especially around traumatic experiences. What we try to do is have them look at those instances in a different way. Like, consider yourself a survivor, Program Director Chris Sutton says. We're just trying to get them to key in on some of those wins that you don't give yourself credit for. Last fall, the University of Chicago Crime Lab released research on the program's effects over time. Teenagers who participated were nearly 40% less likely to be arrested for a violent crime compared to students who weren't in the program. Those results held for up to 2 years afterwards. It's part of a growing body of evidence that this type of therapy can be a powerful tool to reduce violence. On the East Coast, another program using CBT, called ROCA, has seen similar results. In Massachusetts, nearly every young person that stayed with the program for more than 2 years, most of whom had a criminal history, had no new arrests. Jens Ludwig, director of the University of Chicago Crime Lab, says when it comes to what causes violent crime, people tend to give 1 to 2 answers. That some people are amoral and afraid of consequences, or that they're economically desperate. What's interesting about both of these conventional wisdoms is that they implicitly agree at some level on what's causing crime and violence. which is people engaging in some sort of weighing of pros and cons before they act. He says, but Ludwig says many violent crimes are impulsive, not rational. There's even a phrase poker playing use for letting your emotions get the best of you, being on tilt. I think of gun violence as basically being a problem of people being on tilt with guns. Ludwig says, once you conceive of the problem that way, it changes your thinking about what you can do about it. He cautions that these interventions are not a substitute for gun control, but a way to make progress without it. If we have 400 million guns in America, and they're not going anywhere anytime soon, he says, then how do we get people to be less willing to use guns against one another? I finally had somebody to talk to. Young people have a harder time managing emotions than adults, and trauma can make that even harder. Children exposed to violence more likely to become perpetrators of it later on. When kids are exposed to these things on a pretty persistent, regular, daily basis, that has an impact on them emotionally, behaviorally. How they view the world, how they respond to things in the moment, says Dan Flannery, who studies violence prevention at Case Western Reserve University. When you get into a conflict or an argument, how do you resolve it? What are you exposed to in your own families around how things are being handled? Cognitive behavioral therapy has potential to essentially rewire the brain, make it easier to do things like walk away from a beef rather than retaliate. But researchers caution that doing this kind of work is resource intensive, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach. You can't put the same program in 10 different schools that are very different and expect it's going to work the same way, Flannery says. You need the adult, the mentor, the coach, and the teacher that took an interest in you and provided an opportunity or protection at the right time. Which is why this is so hard to just say, hey, if we did this, these 3 things, everything would be better. But in Chicago, Choose to Change is expanding since it first started 10 years ago. In 2018, the city and school district began funding the program so more students would participate. Today, officials at Chicago Public Schools estimate more than 4,000 students have participated. Jadine True, who was, until earlier this month, the district's chief of safety and security, said she took the job more than a decade ago. The dominant mindset was that the school's domain only extended to its walls. As long as students didn't bring situations into the buildings, wherever they did outside the building was no one else's concern, she says. But we know that's not helpful. That's not enough. We have to look at this whole picture. The students in Inglewood finished the program last September. I was doing bad. I'm not gonna lie. I was fighting and stuff a lot, AW says. I finally had somebody talk about it. And yeah, that's what made it better. I had so much built up last year that I didn't get out, but I got it out. AM says, now I'm more in tune with school. While they were in the program, these students took part in a youth competition to design an anti-violence program. They won 3rd place nationally. I got tired of seeing community repeating the same cycle on and on, AM says. I gotta do what I gotta do to better myself. He says he feels like he got a helping hand, but he gives himself credit for taking it. A Delta Airlines passenger jet flips upside down during turbulent landing in Toronto. A regional passenger jet operated by Delta Airlines flipped upside down while landing in Toronto Pearson International Airport on Monday afternoon, injuring 18 people, authorities say. Toronto Airport authorities confirmed that all 4 crew members and 76 passengers were accounted for. Two passengers were critically injured, but are expected to survive. A statement posted by Delta said 18 passengers were injured and are being treated at local hospitals. The extent of their injuries remains unclear. The hearts of the entire global Delta family are with those affected by today's incident at Toronto Pearson International Airport, said Delta CEO Ed Bastian in a statement. I want to express my thanks to the many Delta and Endeavour team members and the first responders on site. Flight 4819 originated in Minneapolis. The CRJ900 regional jet, flown by Endeavour Air, was seen on the ground with smoke rising from it in social media posts. However, the emergency crews managed to extinguish any fire that broke out. As a precaution, all flights at Pearson International Airport were temporarily halted after the 2:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time crash, but have now resumed. Delta said it was suspended all flights to and from Toronto Airport for the remainder of the day. Investigators will begin examining the possible causes of the crash, Canada's Transportation Safety Board said. It was noted that the airport was experiencing gusty winds at the time. National Science Foundation fires roughly 10% of its workforce. Many scientists fear that cuts at NSF will slow or stall advances in basic research, including computer science, causing America to lose its competitive edge. The National Science Foundation fired 168 employees on Tuesday. According to an NSF spokesperson, the firings are to ensure compliance with President Trump's executive order aimed at reducing the federal workforce in the name of efficiency. Prior to the firings, about 1,700 staff worked at NSF, managing their $9 billion federal budget that funds research on everything from astrophysics to civil engineering. Staff were called to an emergency meeting at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, held on Zoom and in person, where they were told by Micah Cheatman, NSF's chief manager, officer, that they'd been terminated by end of day without severance. According to the sources who were present, NSF Director Seth Patch, who ordered the firings, did not attend the meeting. Firing talented people, including scientists, who have already invested a year or two with the agency, is a waste of resources. This is Neil Lane, who served as the director of the NSF from 1993 to 1998. The U.S. needs more scientists, engineers, and other technical talent. These firings will cause many of them to leave the field. NPR spoke with over half a dozen NSF employees, some who still remain at the agency and some who were terminated. NPR has granted them anonymity as they all fear their retaliation for speaking publicly. Either losing their current jobs if they're employed, or for those that let go, fearing the remaining colleagues may be targeted. Many of those fired were program officers who manage research programs by evaluating grants, pulling together research panels, and making decisions about which grants to fund. All that work isn't going to get done. Said one fired consultant who worked on expanding the STEM workforce. We have a need for people trained in these emerging technologies of AI and semiconductors. This is just going to totally devastate our ability to do that. And we will continue to have to rely on foreign workers who are getting that training and coming into this country, which is exactly what I thought the government didn't want to do. The firings targeted probationary employees who have fewer job protections than permanent employees, but still must be fired for cause. Some probationary staff are new to the agency, while others recently promoted or transferred positions. Additionally, all intermittent experts, temporary employees hired at will, often for specific subject matter expertise, were terminated. In termination notices, probationary employees were told, "The agency finds, based on your performance, that you have not demonstrated that your further employment at the agency would be in the public interest." But several of the fired employees who spoke to NPR say they had exemplary records, including awards from the director. I'll be curious to see how the courts handle the blatant lie about the performance. Said one terminated program director. Several fired NSF employees who spoke to NPR were permanent hires, but reclassified as probationary despite having completed their year-long probation period. They say that the reclassification happened in January without explanation. At the director of the White House Office of Personnel Management, everyone is trying to be the very best stewards of tax dollars we can be. One fired program officer in the geosciences resigned from a tenured faculty job after getting official notice that they'd been hired permanently by NSF. My official paperwork is in the system, reflects that I'm permanent. I've not been issued any new documents, not had any formal communication from NSF telling me otherwise, the officer said. That officer left the job security of a tenured position to give back to my country and the scientific community. We certainly not for the pay or the workload, they said. These are some of the hardest working people I've ever met, and everyone is trying to be the very best stewards of tax dollars we can be. One fired employee NPR spoke to worked on ensuring that existing grants were actually doing what the researchers set out to do. Without people like me, there's nobody to oversee the external evaluation or accountability. With fewer staff, grant reviews and awards will slow down or stall out. Employees told NPR, ultimately, that will delay new discoveries that can improve people's lives or scientists' understanding of the natural world. These arbitrary firings and failure of leadership directly impact the agency's ability to evaluate and fund good science, says Mary Feeney, a public policy researcher at Arizona State University. It is demoralizing for those who remain at the NSF and will negatively affect the government's ability to attract talent to public service in the future. The firings come amid a period of tumult at the research agency under the new administration. In late January, NSF paused all grant review for several weeks and temporarily froze funds for existing grants, while they worked to evaluate on their grants complied with Trump's executive orders targeting diversity, equity, and inclusion. Staff has also been told that billions could be cut from the budget, and more firings could be coming over the next couple of months. It's not good, says one NSF employee. I don't know what NSF is going to be now, but it's not more efficient. It's just a mess. Trump wants to lower the cost of IVF. New executive order seeks ideas to do that. IVF is a process that involves retrieving eggs from ovaries, fertilizing them with sperm in lab, and then transferring the embryo into the uterus. President Trump has issued an executive order on Tuesday with the goal of expanding access to and lowering the cost of the fertility treatment known as IVF, or in vitro fertilization. The order directs Trump's assistant for domestic policy to come up with a list of policy ideas for protecting IVF access and aggressively reducing out-of-pocket and health plan costs for IVF treatment within the 90 days. IVF became a hot campaign issue a year ago after the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that frozen embryos created by the procedure are extrauterine children. That led to a pause in IVF in the state until the legislature created a law making it clear IVF clinics couldn't be legally liable if an embryo did not result in live birth. IVF is a process that involves retrieving eggs from ovaries, fertilizing them with sperm in a lab, and then transferring embryos into the uterus. IVF is expensive, with each round costing between $12,000 and $25,000. The order notes many couples need several rounds before they have a healthy pregnancy. Insurance coverage for IVF is spotty, with a lot of state-to-state variation on rules. In the wake of the Alabama ruling, Trump talked about IVF on the campaign trail, promising that IVF would be free for families, either paid for by insurance companies or the government. On Tuesday, White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt posted news of the order on X, saying promises made, promises kept. Senator Patty Murray, Democrat from Washington, called the order a PR stunt on social media and said Republicans have blocked legislation multiple times that would make IVF more accessible and affordable for families. The Catholic Church opposes IVF, and some Republicans support personhood, laws that would give embryos rights and could have an effect on outlawing the treatment. Despite church prohibitions, Catholics still choose IVF to have children. After first meeting while in Catholic school, Aaron and Mickey Whitford dated for 12 years. Through college, grad school, and early into their careers. Then 3 years ago, the Cleveland couple married. We did make a promise to ourselves in front of our whole congregation at our wedding that we were going to accept children and love them and raise them Catholic, Aaron says. It just seems that our journey is a little different. Different because Mickey, due to a genetic condition, has a low sperm count. We had tested the other options as much as we could, Mickey says, and we knew that it was more important for us to bring life into this world than to get the okay from someone on how to do so. Meaning they knew about the Catholic Church's objection to in vitro fertilization, but decided to use the procedure anyway. We prayed, Aaron says. We talked to each other. We talked to our families. Doctors created 3 embryos that the couple could use to have children. One is obviously inside me now, about to be born in the next month, says Erin, as she smiles and places her hand on her stomach. Erin and Mickey plan to use the other embryos in the coming years to grow their family. But they did have to tell their fertility specialists what should become of the embryos in the end, up not using them. The Whitfords decided to donate them for medical research. Our intent is solely to bring life into this world, Mickey says. We understand that few points that the church has around separating the conjugal act from the creation of life. And trust us that if things could have been that way, we would have wanted it to be that way as well. IVF raises concerns about what is natural and what is moral. Religious objections to in vitro fertilization came into sharp focus after the Alabama Supreme Court afforded frozen embryos the same legal protection as children, while many religious groups in the U.S. have no specific prohibition to the procedure. The Catholic Church clearly opposes it, but many Catholic couples turn to IVF despite their church's teaching. The Catholic Church has two main objections to IVF. Procreation is intrinsic to the physical union of the couple, says Roberto Del Oro, professor of theological studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, and a director of the school's Bioethics Institute. He says the first objection to IVF is that it manipulates what should be a natural process. In this case, manipulation of human life for the sake of the desire of a child, he says, but one in which the end does not justify the means. Because IVF usually creates more embryos than the couple needs or wants. Del Oro says the church's chief moral objection is often they are kept frozen for years, but then discarded when a couple decides to not have more children. Other times, these additional embryos are donated to scientific research. Though embryos should not be looked at as children, says Del Oro, they should, however, be seen as having the promise of life that develops into a child. Conscience is a guiding principle for reproductive decisions. It's a conundrum for Catholics with fertility problems who want to have children and want to abide by their church's teachings. But the church has a variety of teachings about reproduction. And for many, the issue has become with the church teaching to uphold. The church takes motherhood very seriously. Says Jamie Manson, president of Catholics for Choice, a group that advocates for abortion rights and other forms of reproductive health care. Including IVF. But the church also creates shame for the very people who are trying to do what the church says it wants them to do, which is have children and create families, she said. Manson worries that the shame leads people away from the Catholic Church. She'd like to see the congregation support couples during the religious questions and emotional stresses that arise during infertility. And in the end, if a couple decides to use IVF to help them have children. Manson says that decision should be considered a valid and defensible religious choice. Conscience is a core tenet of the Catholic faith. She says, the Catechism of the Catholic Church is very, very specific. It says, in all that we say and do, we must have our individual conscience as our guide, and that it's our individual conscience that must determine what is just and right. One's conscience, of course, is formed in a large part by the teachings of one's religion, but it is also informed by reason, emotion, and experience. Data show that while the Catholic Church teaches one thing, the practice and belief of Catholics is quite another. A Pew Research survey in 2023 found that 55% of white, non-Hispanic Catholics say they or someone they know personally have used fertility treatments. And according to a 2023 Pew survey, just 13% of Catholics believe in vitro fertilization is morally wrong. Fertility treatment should be considered gifts from God. More than 2 decades ago, suburban Minneapolis couple Heidi and Dan decided to start a family with the help of IVF. We got married a little bit later in life, Heidi says. We both knew that we wanted to have children, and we were up against the clock. Dan is a lifelong Catholic. Heidi joined the church when they married. We wanted children out of love to really bring up and nourish and love and have, Dan says. The entire way, it was really all about that. As they began IVF treatments, the couple asked their congregation to pray for them during the difficult time. But Heidi, who's a registered nurse, says they did not ask for the priest for approval. It really, really kind of makes me feel very nauseated to have people that are not in the medical profession telling people go through this process that there's something wrong with it, she says. The couple speaks tenderly of the entire process, from meeting with the fertility specialist to the actual appointment of which doctors implanted 2 embryos. The nurses and doctors were extremely caring and loving, Dan says. They turned down the lights, Heidi says. It was sort of romantic. There was wine. They had us choose the music we wanted playing, Dan says. The couple picked Enya's song, Only Time. We didn't have sex, but it was very intimate, Heidi says. A beautiful moment, Dan says. The decision to have kids with the help of the procedure was deeply shaped, says Dan, by Catholic values. The values of the couple gives thanks for every time they think about their now 22-year-old twins, a boy and a girl they consider gifts from God. If this isn't about love, if this is about compassion and the commitment we've made and the joy we've had with our kids, says Dan, I don't know what's more of a miracle than that. An atmospheric river is coming to California. It could bring risks of debris flows. An atmospheric river that hit Los Angeles in February 2024 caused mudslides and flooding, dumping months' worth of rain in a single day. Another one is headed to Southern California now. A rain-filled storm, called an atmospheric river, is sweeping into California. This week, the weather phenomenon could bring heavy rain to many parts of the state, including the areas around Los Angeles that recently burned. Experts are warning that the intense rains could create risks of debris flows and landslides in and around the burned areas. What are atmospheric rivers? Atmospheric rivers, ARs, are a normal part of winter weather along the west coast. They are narrow bands of water vapor that wind sinuously through the atmosphere like a river. They can transport vast quantities of water across the ocean, generally from the warm tropics toward the cooler mid-latitudes like California. One common flavor of AR, explains Christine Shields, an atmospheric scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, is the colloquially termed Pineapple Express. Those AR originate in the tropics near Hawaii and essentially just move water from lower latitude to a higher latitude, like the river on Earth, she says. When the ARs collide with the topography along the coast, they are forced upward higher in the atmosphere. That upward motion causes the water vapor they carry to turn into liquid. It falls out as rain or snow. Sometimes the atmospheric river can also run up against other storms. Adding to the atmospheric churn and often intensifying the precipitation. That may happen during this particular AR, says UCLA climate scientist Daniel Swain. Several ARs usually arrive in California each winter, delivering as much as half the total annual precipitation in some parts of the state. This storm forecast project could add 4 feet of snow of the Sierra Nevada snowpack. That snow can stay frozen until late in the summer, melting slowly and providing water downstream well into the second half of the year. You often hear about them when they are more extreme, and so people assume that they are hazardous, says Julie Kalansky, director of the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes, a group of Scripps Institution of Oceanography that studies atmospheric rivers. But a lot of atmospheric rivers can be extremely beneficial because they bring much needed rain to our region. Scientists at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography created a scale for ranking atmospheric rivers. It takes the duration of the potential precipitation as well the intensity into account. ARs ranked 1 or 2 are generally more beneficial, says Kalansky. Those ranked 4 or 5 have the potential to be more dangerous, she says. What are the concerns and risks of this atmospheric river? This AR is currently forecast as a 1 or 2 in Southern California. But the forecasts indicate that there could be short bursts of extra intense rainfall, Kolansky says. Similar to intense rainfall that caused flooding in San Diego in 2024. Researchers and emergency managers are also particularly worried about severe rain falling on areas that recently burned, like in parts of Los Angeles. High-intensity fire can make soils less able to absorb water. And many of the places that burned in Southern California's January fires have been denuded on vegetation and structures that help hold steep hills in place. A serious blast of rain, says Swain, could destabilize slopes and potentially trigger debris flows or mudslides. After the 2017-2018 Thomas Fire near Santa Barbara, the atmospheric river hit newly burned slopes. The total amount of rain was large, but not unprecedented. But some short bursts of rain dropped more than 3/4 inches in just 15 minutes. The intense rain triggered massive debris flows that killed more than 20 people. Emergency managers and the National Weather Service are warning of the risk of debris flows during this atmospheric river. They are asking people to pay close attention to emergency alerts and evacuations. Is there a climate connection? California's climate can shift dramatically from year to year. The big swings make seeing the fingerprint of human-caused climate change on weather events like atmospheric rivers are challenging, Shields says. So far, the clear link hasn't emerged statistically. But climate scientists expect that to change as the planet warms further. There's very strong evidence that climate change will increase the intensity of atmospheric rivers and the rain, and therefore flood risks that they produce, says Swain. The reason is based on well-established thermodynamics, he explains. Human-driven climate change has primed the atmosphere to hold more of than just water. Atmospheric temperature has risen about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, just over 1 degree Celsius. Since the late 1800s, when people started burning massive volumes of fossil fuels, the atmosphere can hold about 4% more water for every degree Fahrenheit warmer it gets. When the moist air hits mountains on the California coast and gets pushed upward, or if it encounters another storm that turns the air upward into colder parts of the atmosphere, their air cools and its water gets squeezed out, like from a sponge. It's less clear whether or how climate change could influence the overall number of atmospheric rivers or the tracks they takes, says Kalansky. Swain points out that though statistical analysis don't yet show a climate influence, some of the heaviest and the most intense rainfall ever recorded at many different sites across the state have occurred in just the past few years. He calls that ANC data. Not yet enough to provide statistical evidence, but enough to provide common sense signals. That, I think, is telling us something important. Even though the long-term trend is not necessarily statistically significant. Even though the long-term trend is not necessarily significant. The ANC data is in alignment with what the science says should be happening.